Long before the Wild West became legend, two men turned the American frontier into a landscape of fear. They rode ahead of the outlaws who would later fill dime novels and campfire tales, and in some ways, they invented the archetype those later stories borrowed from. They did not rob for wealth. They did not kill for revenge, at least not in any way a court of the time could easily explain. Families vanished from the roadside. Travelers who set out from one town never arrived at the next. For a brief, brutal stretch of the 1790s, a person could ride into a stretch of Kentucky or Tennessee wilderness and simply cease to exist. And everyone who lived along that road knew exactly why, even if no one could prove it. How did two men terrorize an entire region for years before anyone stopped them? What turned two brothers, raised in the same modest household as thousands of other frontier children, into men remembered by historians as America's first documented serial killers? The answers lie partly in blood, partly in war, and partly in a frontier so lawless that violence could hide in plain sight. To understand how the Harpe brothers happened, you first have to understand the world that made room for them. A world where a missing family was tragedy, not evidence, and where the difference between the two depended entirely on who was paying attention, and how closely. The United States, at the close of the 18th century, was not the settled nation we picture today. The revolution had ended, but the peace it produced was thin and uneven, especially west of the Appalachian Mountains. What we now call Tennessee and Kentucky was, at the time, a raw and disputed frontier, claimed on paper by the young United States, but controlled, in practice, by almost no one. Settlers pushed westward in search of land, pulled by promises of cheap soil and the freedom to start over, often carrying little more than what a wagon or a pack horse could hold. Behind them, they left courts, sheriffs, and any real machinery of law. Ahead of them lay forests, rivers, and settlements that might have a magistrate, a preacher, and perhaps a jail. But rarely all three, and rarely anyone with the resources to chase a fleeing criminal beyond the edge of town. This was a region shaped by constant conflict. Cherokee, Chickamauga, and other indigenous nations fought to hold territory against encroaching settlement, and the resulting violence blurred the line between war and lawlessness for both sides. Raids, reprisals, and ambushes were common enough that a body found on a forest trail might be attributed to conflict rather than crime, and no one would necessarily look closer. That confusion, historian Micajah, gave men like the Harpes a kind of camouflage. A missing traveler could be explained a dozen ways on a frontier already soaked in bloodshed from war, disease, and the simple brutality of survival. Communities were small, isolated, and mobile. People arrived as strangers and often left as strangers, drifting further west in search of better land. If a family failed to reach their destination, who would know to ask why? Law enforcement, where it existed, was informal and reactive. There was no coordinated system for tracking criminals across county or territorial lines. A sheriff in one county had no authority in the next, and communication between settlements could take days or weeks, carried by whichever traveler happened to be heading in the right direction. This was the seedbed for the Harpe brothers' spree, a country large enough to swallow the evidence, and disorganized enough that no one was positioned to connect the disappearances into a pattern until the pattern was undeniable. Why did it take so long for anyone to realize a pattern existed at all? Because for years, there was no such thing as a criminal investigation the way we understand it now. There was only word of mouth, rumor, and the occasional grim discovery along a trail, pieced together slowly by people who had every reason to be afraid and very few tools to act on that fear. Add to this the sheer scale of the frontier itself. A murder committed near one river crossing might not be discussed, let alone connected, to a murder committed 2 counties away, simply because the people living in those 2 places rarely spoke to one another with any regularity. News traveled at the speed of a horse, filtered through taverns and church gatherings, and the occasional circuit-riding preacher, and by the time a description of 2 dangerous men reached a settlement 50 miles off, those same men might already have moved on, changed their story, or simply blended back into the anonymous churn of frontier travel. There is also the matter of what the frontier expected violence to look like in the first place. Settlers moving west understood, in a general sense, that the journey was dangerous. Disease killed travelers, exposure killed travelers, accidents on the trail, drownings at river crossings, and skirmishes tied to the ongoing conflict with indigenous nations all killed travelers, and did so regularly enough that a family failing to arrive at its destination did not, by itself, suggest murder at the hands of fellow settlers. This is a crucial and often overlooked point. The Harpe brothers were not operating against a backdrop of peace that made their violence stand out sharply. They were operating against a backdrop already saturated with death from a dozen ordinary causes, which meant their particular brand of violence had to reach an unusual scale and an unusual pattern of repetition before anyone could distinguish it from the general hazard of frontier life. This also raises a question historians continue to turn over: how many other disappearances from this period, never connected to the Harpes at all, might actually have been their work, simply lost to a record that was never built to capture them in the first place? There is no way to answer that question with certainty, and honest historians resist the temptation to inflate the number simply because the uncertainty makes a larger figure tempting. The Harpe brothers were known to history as Micajah Harpe, called Big Harpe, and Wiley Harpe, called Little Harpe. For years, popular tradition described them as brothers, and that is the name history has settled on, though a number of historians now believe they may actually have been cousins. Record-keeping on the frontier, especially for families like theirs, was inconsistent, and the surviving documentation does not settle the question definitively. What is generally agreed upon is that they were raised in North Carolina, in a family with Loyalist sympathies during the Revolutionary War, a detail that mattered enormously in that time and place. Loyalist families, those who had supported the British Crown rather than the rebelling colonies, often faced suspicion, social exclusion, and outright hostility once the war ended and independence was secured. Neighbors who had fought and lost sons and husbands to that war did not easily forgive families who had stood, even quietly, on the other side. Whether this early experience of being outsiders in their own community shaped the brothers' later path is something historians can only speculate about. There is no direct testimony from either brother explaining their motivations in those terms, and it would be a mistake to draw too straight a line between a difficult childhood and a life of murder, since countless children of Loyalist families grew up to live entirely ordinary lives. What can be said with more confidence is that the family relocated west in the years following the Revolution, part of the broader wave of migration into Tennessee, and that the brothers grew up on a frontier where violence, displacement, and instability was simply the backdrop of daily life, rather than an exception to it. Details of their childhood are thin. Unlike a modern criminal case, there is no trove of school records, medical notes, or neighbor interviews describing early warning signs. What survives are fragments, land records, court documents from later years, and second-hand accounts written down by people who knew the family or claimed to. This means much of what popular retellings say about the brothers' early years, including colorful claims about cruelty to animals or early violent tendencies, should be treated with caution. Some of it may be true. Some of it may be later embellishment, added. Once the brothers had already become infamous, and people wanted an origin story that explained the horror to come, a satisfying childhood villainy to match the adult monstrosity everyone already believed in. A serious historical account has to admit that gap rather than paper over it, rather than filling the silence of the historical record with confident detail simply because a confident detail makes for a more compelling telling. What is documented is that both brothers eventually married, and that their household arrangements were unconventional for the time, with each brother's family, and in some accounts, multiple wives per brother, traveling together as they moved through the frontier. This blending of households would later complicate the historical record further, since it is not always clear which women and children belonged to which brother, or how willingly they were involved in what came next. Some of these women would later testify against the brothers, providing crucial detail to authorities, which suggests they were not simply willing partners in the violence but people caught inside a dangerous and controlling household they had limited power to leave. A reality easy to overlook in a story so often told purely from the outlaw's point of view. It is worth pausing on this point, because it complicates the simple villain narrative that popular retellings often prefer. The women who traveled with the Harpe brothers, and the children born into that traveling household, occupied an extraordinarily precarious position. Frontier life offered few avenues for a woman to simply leave a dangerous husband or partner, particularly one who kept his family constantly moving through unfamiliar territory, far from any family of her own who might have intervened or offered shelter. Isolation, in other words, was not only a tool the brothers used against their victims, it was also, whether by design or circumstance, a condition that kept the women in their own household bound to them long after any reasonable person might have wished to escape. When the opportunity to testify against the brothers finally came, following Big Harpe's death, at least one of these women provided authorities with detail that helped confirm the scope of the killings, including the death of the infant child. Historians reading this testimony centuries later have to weigh it carefully. A woman testifying about the death of her own child, under the scrutiny of a frontier court and likely under considerable social pressure, was not operating in ideal conditions for calm, dispassionate testimony, and yet her account remains one of the most direct pieces of evidence historians have for understanding what actually happened inside that household. The economic conditions of the frontier deserve mention as well, since they shaped who traveled these roads and why. Peddlers carrying small goods between settlements, families relocating with everything they owned loaded onto a single wagon, and solitary travelers seeking new opportunity all moved along the same narrow network of trails, often with little protection beyond a single firearm and whatever caution they could muster. These were not wealthy travelers guarded by armed escorts. They were, for the most part, ordinary people making an extraordinarily vulnerable journey, which made them easy targets not because they carried great riches, but because they carried almost no ability to defend themselves or summon help once trouble began. A cry along a lonely stretch of the wilderness road might carry for a few hundred yards through dense timber and then simply vanish, unheard by anyone who might have intervened. This vulnerability was not unique to the Harpe's victims. It was the condition of frontier travel itself, and it is worth remembering that the same isolation that made settlement possible also made predation possible. Two sides of the same coin minted by a young nation expanding faster than it could govern. The transformation from frontier settlers to killers did not happen overnight, and it did not happen in isolation. Historians point to the mid-1790s as the period when the brothers' activities shifted from ordinary frontier roughness into something more organized and more violent. There is evidence connecting the Harpes to raiding parties associated with the Chickamauga, a militant faction that had split from the broader Cherokee Nation and continued fighting against encroaching settlement long after other factions had sought peace. Some historians believe the brothers participated in raids against settler communities during this period, blurring the line between combatant and criminal in a way that was, again, common on a frontier defined by ongoing conflict. This is one of those points where the record is genuinely contested. Were the Harpes acting as raiders allied with Chickamauga fighters, or were they using the chaos of frontier warfare as cover for their own predation? The honest answer is that both explanations appear in the historical literature, and it is difficult, more than 2 centuries later, to fully separate one from the other. What is not disputed is that by the time the brothers resurface clearly in the documentary record, in the closing years of the 1790s, they were operating as something distinct from raiders or petty criminals. They were killing, methodically and repeatedly, and the killings were not tied to theft, territory, or any conventional motive that observers at the time could identify. This absence of clear motive is part of what makes the case so significant to criminal historians. Most frontier violence in this era had an explanation, even a brutal one: land disputes, robbery, revenge, war. The Harpes' killings increasingly did not fit that pattern. Victims were sometimes robbed, but often not, or only of trivial items, while the killing itself seemed to be the point, a detail that unsettled even people accustomed to a violent world. This is part of why some historians and criminologists have retroactively described the Harpe brothers as America's first documented serial killers, using a modern framework to describe a pattern of behavior that predates the term by more than a century and a half. Did they have accomplices? For a period, yes. The brothers were associated with a river pirate named Samuel Mason, who operated out of a cave along the Ohio River known as Cavern Rock, a notorious haunt for outlaws preying on flatboat traffic, moving goods and settlers downriver. Mason's operation was primarily about robbery, ambushing travelers and stealing their goods, and for a time the Harpes moved in that same circle, using the cave as a base and a place to disappear between attacks. But witnesses and later accounts suggest a growing rift between the brothers and Mason's group, driven by the Harpes' apparent indifference to profit and their escalating brutality, which even hardened river pirates reportedly found excessive. This detail, if accurate, is telling. It suggests that whatever the Harpes were doing, it was not, primarily, an economic enterprise. It was something else, and it eventually made them too dangerous even for men who made their living through robbery and violence, men who by any ordinary measure were themselves considered dangerous outlaws. The methods of the brothers also appear to have shifted over this period, moving from opportunistic violence tied loosely to robbery towards something more deliberate. Early incidents attributed to the Harpes sometimes involved disputes or confrontations that escalated, the kind of violence a frontier court might have understood, however grimly, as a fight gone too far. Later incidents show a colder pattern, victims selected seemingly for convenience, killed with little preamble, and disposed of with an efficiency that suggests practice rather than panic. Cave in Rock itself deserves a moment of description, since it played such a significant role in this middle period of the brothers' activity. Set into a limestone bluff along the Ohio River, the cave was large enough to shelter a substantial group of people and their equipment, and its position gave anyone using it a clear view of river traffic passing below. Traffic that in this period consisted largely of flatboats carrying settlers, goods, and livestock downriver toward new territory. For outlaws like Samuel Mason, the cave functioned as both a hideout and a kind of informal headquarters, a place to plan ambushes, divide stolen goods, and disappear when pursuit grew too close. The Harpe brothers' association with this place and this group situates them within a broader ecosystem of frontier crime that existed along the Ohio River during this period, one that later gave rise to its own body of legend, entirely separate from the Harpe story. But the split between the Harpes and Mason's group, whenever exactly it occurred, marks an important shift in how historians understand the brothers. Robbery-focused river piracy was a rational, if illegal, response to the economic opportunity presented by unprotected river traffic. What the Harpes did increasingly resembled something else, something that resists the same rational economic explanation, and that resistance to easy explanation is precisely what has kept their case a subject of ongoing historical and even psychological interest. The murder spree most closely associated with the Harpe brothers took place across a roughly year-long period spanning parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, and the surrounding frontier, generally dated to around 1798 through 1799. Historians who have attempted to reconstruct the full list of victims cautioned that the number is uncertain and likely incomplete. Some estimates place the confirmed or strongly suspected death toll between 20 and 40 people, though the higher end of that range relies on circumstantial evidence and disappearances that were never fully documented at the time. What is documented, through surviving court records and contemporary accounts, includes a disturbing range of victims: travelers on the road, a young peddler, a farmer and his family, and, in one of the most disturbing episodes attributed to the brothers, an infant child. According to court testimony given later, one of Big Harpe's own infant daughters was killed, reportedly because her crying had irritated him during a journey. This account comes from testimony given by one of the Harpe wives and should be understood within that context. It is a first-hand claim, but not something independently corroborated by outside witnesses, since the act itself would have occurred without observers. Historians generally treat it as credible. Given the specificity of the testimony and the pattern of behavior, it fits, but it remains, technically, a single-source account, and readers should hold that distinction in mind, rather than treating every detail as settled fact. The brothers' methods, as described in surviving accounts, were often marked by a kind of improvisation and brutality that distinguished them from more calculated criminals of the era. Victims were frequently killed with edged weapons or bludgeoned, their bodies weighted and disposed of in rivers or creeks, or left along remote stretches of trail. Why dispose of bodies in water at all, if there was no attempt to hide the broader pattern of killing? Some historians suggest it reflects a kind of practical opportunism rather than careful planning. Rivers and creeks were simply the terrain available, a convenient way to delay discovery long enough to keep moving, rather than evidence of a deliberate strategy to avoid detection altogether. The brothers' route during this period tracked the Wilderness Road and connecting trails through Kentucky and Tennessee, a corridor increasingly traveled by settlers, traders, and peddlers heading toward new land in the west. This route gave them a steady supply of potential victims, most of them strangers to the region and to each other, which made the disappearances harder to connect. A missing peddler here, a missing family there, scattered across weeks and dozens of miles, did not immediately read as the work of two men. It read, if it read as anything organized at all, as the general danger of frontier travel, an unfortunate but expected hazard of a road that everyone already understood to be dangerous for a dozen other reasons. Community reaction, once the pattern began to emerge, moved from unease to open terror. Surviving witnesses, including travelers who encountered the brothers and escaped, or who saw them shortly before or after an attack, gave descriptions that began circulating along the frontier communication networks of taverns, river landings, and church gatherings. This informal network of gossip and warning, historian sage, was often faster and more effective at spreading alarm than any formal law enforcement mechanism the frontier possessed, even if it was slower and less precise than anything we would recognize today as an investigation. What transformed ordinary outlaws into feared killers in the eyes of the communities living through it was not just the body count. It was the sense that reason did not apply. Robbers could be avoided by carrying little of value. The Harps, according to the accumulating testimony, could not be reasoned with or bargained with in the way other frontier criminals sometimes could, and that unpredictability, more than any single act, seems to be what settled into the collective memory of the region as genuine dread. Consider what it meant, practically, for a household along this stretch of frontier to live with that dread. A farmer stepping outside at dusk to check on livestock might pause at an unfamiliar sound in the tree line. A family preparing to set out on a journey the next morning might delay a day, or take a longer but more populated route, based on nothing more concrete than a rumor passed along at a river landing. This is the texture of fear that rarely makes it into the surviving documentary record, because fear of this kind does not generate court documents or official reports. It shows up instead in the choices people made, choices that historians can only infer from indirect evidence: shifting travel patterns, increased requests for armed escort along certain stretches of road, and the simple fact that certain trails developed reputations that persisted for years after the specific danger had passed. The Harpe brothers, in this sense, reshaped the practical geography of the frontier itself, at least for a time, altering how people moved through a landscape that had, until their spree, been dangerous in familiar and somewhat predictable ways. As the disappearances mounted and survivors began providing consistent descriptions, informal manhunts began to form, organized not by any centralized authority but by local settlers, militia members, and county officials acting on their own initiative. This is an important distinction from how we imagine manhunts today. There was no coordinated posse dispatched by a governor or federal authority. Instead, the response was local, fragmented, and driven largely by outrage and fear within the specific communities that brothers had passed through. Witnesses played a critical role in finally connecting the killings into a recognizable pattern. Several people who encountered the Harps and survived, either because the brothers let them go, or because circumstances interrupted an attack, gave descriptions that were consistent enough, over time, to convince authorities and settlers that a specific pair of men was responsible for a growing list of disappearances and murders across multiple counties. One particularly important account came from a woman who had briefly traveled with the brothers' extended household, and whose testimony helped authorities understand not just the brothers' appearance and habits but the composition of their traveling group, which included the wives and children mentioned earlier. This detail matters because it helps explain how the brothers evaded capture for as long as they did. A group that included women and children moving together did not immediately register to observers along the road as a band of killers. It looked, on the surface, like an ordinary, if somewhat unusual traveling family, the kind of household that might draw a second glance but rarely suspicion of murder. How did they avoid capture for so long, given that their crimes were becoming known? Part of the answer is geography. The frontier they operated in was vast, sparsely settled, and crossed jurisdictional lines that made coordinated pursuit difficult. A group of pursuers from one county might give up the chase at a river or county line, uncertain of their authority or unwilling to venture further from home. Part of the answer is also the brothers' own mobility and apparent willingness to keep moving constantly, never settling long enough in one place for local suspicion to fully solidify into organized action. There were several documented near captures during this period. Local authorities in more than one Kentucky or Tennessee settlement attempted to detain the brothers on suspicion, sometimes successfully holding them briefly, only for the brothers to escape custody, a reflection of how informal and under-resourced frontier jails and law enforcement genuinely were. In at least one instance, Historical accounts describe Big Harpe being held for a time on an unrelated charge before the true scope of his crimes was understood, after which he escaped before he could be properly tried. These escapes fed into the growing sense of dread surrounding the brothers, the fear that ordinary measures were simply insufficient to stop them. As word spread and the confirmed and suspected victims accumulated, the informal manhunt hardened into something closer to an organized pursuit, driven by a coalition of local settlers, determined to end the killings themselves. Given how little confidence remained in the ability of distant, under-resourced authorities to do it for them, it is worth noting how unusual this kind of grassroots cross-community pursuit actually was for the period. Frontier settlements were often more focused on their own immediate survival than on cooperating with neighboring communities, particularly when cooperation meant sending armed men away from home for days at a time, leaving their own families and farms exposed. That a coalition formed at all speaks to the scale of alarm the Harpes had generated by this point, alarms significant enough to override the usual insularity of frontier life. Some historians have described this moment as an early, informal precursor to the kind of interjurisdictional cooperation that would later become standard in American law enforcement, though it would be generous to call it organized in any modern sense. It was closer to a shared, urgent consensus among armed neighbors that no one else was coming to solve this problem for them, and that consensus, however improvised, proved effective where months of scattered official effort had not. Part 4. The final pursuit of the Harpe brothers centers on events in the summer of 1799, following an attack on the household of a man named Moses Stegall in Kentucky. According to the surviving accounts, the brothers killed members of the Stegall household, an act that proved to be a critical turning point, because Stegall himself survived and became a driving force in organizing the pursuit that followed. He assembled a small group of local men determined to track the brothers down, and this posse, smaller and more determined than earlier informal efforts, pursued the Harpes through the Kentucky wilderness over the following days, moving with a sense of personal stakes that the earlier, more diffuse manhunts had lacked. What really happened during the final confrontation is, again, an area where historical accounts vary somewhat in detail, though the broad outline is well supported. The pursuing party caught up with the Harpe brothers, and in the resulting confrontation, Big Harpe Micajah was shot and mortally wounded. Accounts describe a brutal end, rather than a quick death. Big Harpe reportedly lingered, and in some of the more grim details preserved in local tradition, was decapitated after his death, with his head placed on a pole or stake along a roadway as a warning to other would-be outlaws. A common, if gruesome practice of the era, intended to serve as public deterrence, rather than simple cruelty, at least in the logic of the people who carried it out. The road where this reportedly occurred came to be known locally as Harpe's Head Road, a name that persisted in the local landscape for generations afterward, itself a kind of historical marker of how deeply this event embedded itself in regional memory, long after the people who had lived through the fear firsthand were gone. Wiley Harpe, Little Harpe, escaped the confrontation that killed his brother. His story does not end there, however, and this is a detail often lost in popular retellings that treat the Harpe saga as ending with Big Harpe's death, as though the story required a single, tidy conclusion to satisfy the shape of a legend. Wiley resurfaced years later, using an alias, and rejoined the orbit of Samuel Mason, the river pirate the brothers had once associated with, eventually participating in Mason's death under circumstances that themselves became notorious. Wiley Harpe and an accomplice reportedly killed Mason in an attempt to collect a bounty that had been placed on Mason's head, presenting Mason's severed head to authorities as proof, only to be recognized themselves as wanted men in the process, undone by the very act they had hoped would earn them a reward. Wiley Harpe was ultimately captured, tried, and executed in 1804, several years after his brother's death, bringing a final, documented close to the story of both men. This extended timeline is itself instructive. The popular image of a single, tidy manhunt ending in a single climactic confrontation does not match the more scattered, years-long reality of how the Harpe brothers' story actually concluded. The years between Big Harpe's death and Wiley Harpe's eventual capture are themselves worth dwelling on, because they show how easily a wanted man could still disappear into the vastness of the frontier, even after becoming one of the most notorious names in the region. Wiley did not simply vanish into obscurity during this period. He adopted a new identity, moved through territory where his face and his brother's face were not immediately recognized, and eventually found his way back into the same world of river crime that had shaped the brother's middle years. That he was able to do this at all, years after his brother's death, had presumably spread his description across the same informal communication networks that had once tracked the brother's movements, says something important about the limits of frontier notoriety. Being known as a wanted man in one region did not guarantee recognition in another, especially if enough time had passed and a person was willing to change his name and his story. The final unraveling of Wiley Harpe's disguise came, fittingly, through his own actions rather than through any pursuit. His decision to kill Samuel Mason and present the evidence for a bounty was a gamble that required him to step directly into official scrutiny, the very thing he had spent years avoiding, and it was that gamble, rather than any manhunt, that finally exposed him. There is a kind of grim irony in this, one that historians have noted. The man who had evaded capture for years through constant movement and reinvention was ultimately undone, not by pursuit but by his own attempt to profit from the very world of frontier crime he had never fully left behind. The legacy of the Harpe brothers within American history is a curious one, occupying a strange space between forgotten footnote and foundational myth. For historians of crime, they represent one of the earliest well-documented cases in American history of what we would now recognize as serial killing. Repeated murders, across an extended period, without a consistent robbery or revenge motive, carried out by identifiable individuals whose crimes were connected through investigation, however informal, and testimony. This has led some scholars to treat the Harpe case as a kind of origin point for American true crime as a genre and a preoccupation, predating the more famous cases of the 19th and 20th centuries by decades, or, in some cases, over a century. The influence on American frontier culture was also immediate and lasting. Stories of the Harpe brothers circulated widely in the decades following their deaths, told and retold in local histories, newspaper accounts, and eventually more sensationalized retellings that took considerable liberties with the documented facts. This is where the gap between legend and historical evidence becomes especially wide. Popular culture versions of the Harpe story often exaggerate the death toll, invent specific details of violence that have no basis in surviving records, and flatten the brothers into simple embodiments of evil, stripped of the more complicated and uncertain historical context, including the questions about their actual family relationship, their possible involvement in frontier conflict, and the genuinely unclear scope of their crimes. Why are historians still debating parts of their story more than 2 centuries later? Largely because the primary sources are thin, inconsistent, and often written well after the events they describe, shaped by the storytelling conventions and moral concerns of their own time, rather than by anything resembling modern evidentiary standards. Court records exist for some events, but not all. Witness testimony survives in fragments, often second-hand or third-hand, by the time it was written down. This means that any account of the Harpe brothers, including this one, has to be understood as a reconstruction built from imperfect materials, weighted toward the interpretations that most surviving evidence supports, but not free of uncertainty. Common misconceptions about the brothers persist widely. Many popular accounts describe them simply as outlaws or bandits, collapsing the specific and unusual nature of their crimes into a more generic frontier criminal archetype, when the documented pattern of killing without clear material motive is precisely what makes their case historically distinct. Other accounts inflate their body count well beyond what the historical record can support, or invent specific atrocities that appear nowhere in primary sources, driven by the same impulse toward embellishment that has shaped true crime storytelling for as long as it has existed. Still others compress the timeline, suggesting the brothers were caught and killed together, when the documented record shows Wiley Harpe survived his brother by roughly 5 years and met his own end in a separate and almost equally strange sequence of events. The persistence of these misconceptions says something about why the story endures at all. A tidy, symmetrical tale of 2 monstrous brothers meeting justice together is simply more satisfying than the messier truth of one death by posse and one death by gallows. Years apart, tied together by little more than blood, or perhaps cousinhood, and a shared taste for violence that neither man ever adequately explained to anyone who survived to ask. The Harpe case also occupies an interesting place in the broader history of how Americans have told stories about crime and punishment. In the decades following the brothers' deaths, regional historians and amateur chroniclers began compiling accounts of frontier violence for audiences hungry for tales of danger successfully overcome, a genre that flattered the communities telling the stories as much as it horrified them. The Harps fit neatly into this tradition, villains monstrous enough to justify the violence used against them, defeated ultimately by the resolve of ordinary settlers rather than by any distant government authority. This framing served a purpose beyond simple entertainment. It reinforced a particular narrative about the frontier itself, one in which local communities, through their own courage and cooperation, could impose order on a lawless landscape without needing to wait for help from more established centers of power back east. Whether or not that narrative fully reflects the messier reality of near misses, escaped custody, and years of unchecked killing that preceded the brothers' downfall is, again, a question modern historians have had to revisit with more skepticism than earlier chroniclers typically applied. Later writers, working well into the 19th and 20th centuries, continued to reshape the story according to the tastes of their own eras, sometimes emphasizing the brothers' cruelty for shock value, sometimes using their story as a parable about frontier lawlessness more broadly, and sometimes, especially in more recent retellings, attempting to psychologically explain behavior that the surviving historical record simply does not have the detail to fully support. Each retelling reveals as much about the period that produced it as it does about the two men at the center of the story, a pattern common to almost every enduring true crime narrative, where the story tells us at least as much about its audience as it does about its subject. In summary, the Harpe brothers, Micajah and Wiley, operated across the Tennessee and Kentucky frontier in the closing years of the 1700s, killing a number of people that historians estimate, with real uncertainty, somewhere between 20 and 40. They were able to operate for as long as they did because of the specific conditions of the American frontier at that time: vast, thinly governed territory, fragmented and under-resourced law enforcement, ongoing conflict with indigenous nations that provided cover and confusion, and a highly mobile, transient population, among whom disappearances were difficult to track and connect. Their origins lay in a Loyalist family from North Carolina that relocated west after the Revolution, though many details of their childhood remain unverifiable, filled in over the years by speculation rather than documentation. Their crimes escalated from possible involvement in frontier raiding into a sustained, difficult-to-explain pattern of murder that eventually drew the attention and organized pursuit of local communities, culminating in Big Harpe's death at the hands of a posse led by Moses Stegall in 1799, and Wiley Harpe's eventual capture and execution in 1804 following his own strange final chapter involving the death of Samuel Mason. It is worth reiterating, clearly, the difference between the legend that grew up around these two men and the historical evidence that actually survives. The legend offers certainty, a fixed body count, a clean narrative, a satisfying and total ending. The historical evidence offers something messier: fragments of testimony, contested family relationships, an uncertain number of victims, and a story that, in Wiley Harpe's case, continued for years after most retellings consider it finished. That gap between legend and evidence is not a flaw in the historical record. It is, in many ways, the most honest thing the record can tell us, that even in cases as extreme and well documented as this one, the past resists the neatness we often want to impose on it. Two men, operating in the blind spots of a young and disorganized nation, became something like a warning built into the landscape itself. A road named for a severed head, a story told and retold until the facts and the fear blurred together. Perhaps that blurring is its own kind of legacy, a reminder that the line between history and myth is often drawn not by what happened, but by what people needed the story to mean, and a reminder, too, that behind every legend of this kind there were real people, real families, and real losses that no amount of storytelling ever fully accounts for. There is one more thing worth considering before closing this account, and it has less to do with the Harpe brothers specifically than with what their case reveals about the limits of historical knowledge more broadly. Modern audiences, accustomed to detailed forensic investigation, extensive documentation, and instant communication, sometimes struggle to appreciate just how much of the past simply was not recorded, or was recorded so thinly that later generations are left reconstructing entire chapters of a story from a handful of court filings and second-hand recollections. The Harpe brothers happen to be well enough documented, by the standards of their era, to support a reasonably confident account of their crimes. and their eventual deaths. Many other frontier criminals of the period left no comparable record at all. Their crimes, if they occurred, absorbed entirely into the general uncertainty of frontier disappearance. This makes the Harpe case valuable, not just as a grim curiosity, but as a kind of case study in how history gets written and unwritten, in the gaps between what happened and what anyone thought to preserve. The next time a story like this one is told, with confident dates, precise numbers, and a clean narrative arc, it is worth asking what lies underneath that confidence, and how much of it was built, brick by brick, out of testimony given under duress, memories reshaped by fear, and the simple human desire to give a senseless string of violence some kind of shape and ending. That is, in the end, the real story behind the Harpe brothers, not just what two men did to a vulnerable frontier, but what an entire region, and the generations that came after it, needed to believe about how that violence finally came to an end. Keep that in mind whenever this story, or one like it, is told again. Every date, every number, and every name rests on a foundation that was already imperfect the moment it was first written down, more than 2 centuries ago, by people doing their best with the tools and the fear available to them at the time.